My name is Mara Voss. I'm 33, and I audit hospital procurement contracts for fraud. I carry a silver fountain pen my grandmother gave me, and I only take it out when something needs to be signed permanently, not casually. Contracts, settlements, the marriage license I'd signed 4 hours earlier that morning. So when my sister walked down the aisle of my own wedding reception wearing a white dress that wasn't a bridesmaid dress, stood up in front of 140 guests holding a champagne flute, and announced that I had stolen her fiancé, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I set my own glass down on the table, looked at her, and said 4 words. "Ask him yourself." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind you can't fake, because she genuinely believed she'd already won. And that's when my new mother-in-law, a 71-year-old woman named Eleanor Bennett, who had said maybe 40 words to me in the 6 months I'd known her, rose from her chair at the head table, held up her phone, tapped it once, and said, "Everyone, you need to hear this recording." The room went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when it senses, before it understands, that something is about to become permanent. My sister's smile didn't move yet. It would. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out the other side with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the one who fixes things while everyone else gets to fall apart, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me back up. Because to understand what was on that phone, you need to understand what my sister had been building toward for 11 months, and what none of us, including me, knew she'd already started the day I got engaged. I grew up the second daughter in a house that only had room for one exceptional child at a time, and my sister Delphine got there first. Delphi is 2 years older than me, and from the time I was small, our house ran on a rule nobody ever wrote down, but everyone obeyed. My mother, Carol, said it so often it stopped sounding like an instruction and started sounding like weather. In this family, we handle things ourselves. It sounded noble. It wasn't. What it actually meant was, whatever Delphi does, we absorb it internally, and whoever absorbs the most without complaint is the one who gets called reliable. I got called reliable a lot. I was 12 when Delphi wrecked my father's car and told him I'd been the one who begged to drive it around the block. I was quiet for 3 days, because in this family, we handle things ourselves, and I didn't want to be the kind of daughter who caused a scene. I was 16 when Delphi took money from a jar my grandmother kept for my college fund, spent it on a dress for a dance, and cried so convincingly when confronted that our mother told me to apologize to her for making her feel accused. I said sorry. I meant it, too, at 16, because I didn't yet understand what I was actually apologizing for. By the time I was in my 20s, I'd built a life that ran on the opposite operating system from the one I grew up in. I don't absorb things quietly anymore. I document them. I have a folder on my laptop labeled simply Records, and it has been open, in some form, since I was 24 years old and a coworker tried to claim credit for an audit I'd built from scratch. I learned that day that memory is negotiable, but a timestamp is not. My job exists because hospital systems process thousands of contracts a year. And somewhere in that volume, someone is always quietly moving numbers where they don't belong, betting that no one will look closely enough or soon enough to catch it before the fiscal year closes. I catch it. I've built my entire adult identity around being the person who catches it. I met Theo Bennett 2.5 years ago at a mutual friend's fundraiser, and what I noticed first wasn't his face. It was that he refiled a stack of raffle tickets someone had dropped, in order, without being asked, while everyone else stepped over them. I have a thing for people who fix small disorder without needing credit for it. We dated quietly for a year before either of us said anything to our families, because both of us, it turned out, had learned the hard way that announcing things too early invites other people to have opinions about them. When we finally did tell people, my mother's first question wasn't, "Are you happy?" It was, "Does Delphi know yet?" I remember that specific sentence because it told me everything about the order operations would run in for the rest of my engagement. Theo would have to be introduced to Delphi, approved by Delphi, understood, somehow, in relation to Delphi. I want to be fair here, because fairness is the entire point of how I operate. Delphi is not a cartoon. She is charming in restaurants, generous with compliments, the person who remembers your coffee order the second time she meets you. That charm is real, and it's also a tool, and by the time I was 30, I'd learned to tell the difference between when Delphi liked me and when Delphi needed something from the room I happened to be standing in. What I didn't fully understand, not for months, was that my engagement had become something Delphi needed to be standing in the center of. It started small, the way these things always do, in scenes I only recognized as a pattern in hindsight. 3 weeks after Theo proposed, Delphi asked to meet him properly, just the three of us, at a wine bar downtown. I thought it was sweet. She spent the evening asking him questions that sounded like curiosity and were actually cataloging. Where he went to college, what his family's business was, whether his mother, Eleanor, was as intense as people said. Theo, who is disarmingly straightforward, answered everything honestly, including the fact that his mother had built a regional logistics company from a single delivery van and did not suffer foolishness. Delphi laughed and said Eleanor sounded like someone she'd get along with. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to want. 2 months later, at a family dinner, my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, that Delphi had been going through a rough patch with her own long-term boyfriend, a man named Curtis she'd been with for 4 years and had, at one point, expected to marry. I asked what happened. My mother said, "You know Delphi? She doesn't like to talk about it," which in our family means the topic is closed until Delphi decides to reopen it on her own terms, usually at the worst possible moment for someone else. I didn't think much of it. I had a wedding to plan, a full-time forensic audit caseload, and a fiancé whose mother I was trying to build a relationship with, despite Eleanor's famous reluctance to warm up to anyone quickly. Here's the part that's hard to admit. I noticed things. I noticed that Delphi started liking every photo Theo posted before I did. I noticed she started referring to him by a nickname. Bennett, just the last name, the way you'd talk about someone you'd known for years, not someone you'd met a handful of times. I noticed that at my engagement party, she wore a dress in the exact shade of blue Theo had once mentioned, in passing, as his favorite color, a detail I only remembered because I'd filed it away the way I file everything away. I noticed, and I did the thing my whole upbringing had trained me to do. I told myself I was being paranoid because in this family, we handle things ourselves, and a woman who audits contracts for a living should know better than to build a case out of coincidences. That's the mistake I want you to sit with for a second, because I think a lot of you have made it too. I had the exact skill set to see the pattern early, and I talked myself out of using it, because using it on my own sister felt like a betrayal of the role I'd been assigned my whole life. The fixer doesn't accuse. The fixer absorbs. Let me jump forward 6 months to the week of my bridal shower, because this is where the pattern stopped being deniable. My mother hosted the shower at her house, and Delphi arrived 40 minutes late with a gift bag and an announcement that she and Curtis had taken a break. She cried a little, in the tasteful way she cries, and the entire shower reorganized itself around her for 20 minutes before anyone remembered whose day it was supposed to be. I want to be honest. I wasn't angry about that. Not really. Breakups are real, and if my sister was hurting, I didn't begrudge her the room. What I noticed was who she looked at while she talked about it. Not our mother, not her friends. She kept glancing at the corner of the yard where Theo was standing with my father, and every time Theo laughed at something my dad said, Delphi's face did something small and specific that I recognized because I do the same thing when I catch a discrepancy in a ledger before I've consciously admitted I've caught it. 3 weeks before the wedding, I found the first document. I wasn't looking for it. I was borrowing my mother's laptop to print a seating chart because my own printer was out of ink, and her email was open, and there, near the top of an unarchived thread, was a message from Delphi with the subject line, Wedding Day. Logistics, sent to our mother, and to 2 of Delphi's closest friends, Priya and Sage, who were both attending the wedding as my guests, not hers. I told myself it was probably about carpooling. I opened it anyway, because 11 months of small, strange things had finally accumulated into something my training wouldn't let me walk past. It wasn't about carpooling. The email laid out, in Delphi's calm, organized handwriting of a voice, a plan for the reception. She'd reserved a white dress from a boutique 2 towns over, specifically chosen, she wrote, because it was close enough to bridal without being identical, so nobody can say I did it on purpose. She'd asked Priya to be near the head table with her phone recording. In case things get dramatic, we'll want it for later. She referenced something called the photo, which she said she'd finally gotten a usable copy of, and said that once she made her announcement, she wanted Sage positioned near Theo's side of the family so she could watch Eleanor's face when it lands. The email ended with a single line that I read 4 times before I let myself fully understand it. She's had everything handed to her whole life. This is the one thing I actually earned first. I sat at my mother's kitchen table for a long time after I read that. Not crying, cataloging. Because underneath the hurt, the part of my brain that does this professionally had already started asking the questions it always asks. What photo? Earned first, meaning what? And why was my own mother copied on an email planning to sabotage my wedding? And why hadn't she said a single word to me about it? I didn't confront anyone that day. I want to explain why. Because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand about people like me. It wasn't fear. It was math. I had 3 weeks until the wedding. A sister who had apparently been building toward this moment for months, and a family system that had spent 30 years training everyone, including me, to believe that raising an alarm early gets you labeled as the dramatic one, while staying quiet and gathering proof gets you believed. I had learned that lesson at 12 years old in a wrecked car I never drove. I wasn't going to unlearn it 3 weeks before my wedding out of panic. I was going to do what I do for a living. I was going to find out what the photo meant. And I was going to find out before Delphi got to decide when I found out. It took 4 days. And it took a conversation with Theo I didn't want to have but couldn't avoid. I asked him, carefully, without accusation, whether he and Delphi had ever. Anything. Dated. Almost dated. Kissed at a party neither of them mentioned. Anything that could be photographed and reframed. He looked at me like I'd asked whether he'd secretly been born on Mars. No, never. He'd met Delphi for the first time the same week he met me, at that same mutual friends fundraiser, months before he and I had even exchanged numbers. I believed him instantly, not because I'm naive, but because Theo Bennett is constitutionally incapable of hiding anything. It's one of the reasons I trust him with my actual life. But I needed more than belief. I needed the photo. I found it through Sage, of all people, who it turned out was far less committed to Delphi's plan than Delphi assumed. Sage and I had never been close, but 3 weeks before my wedding, she called me. Not texted, called. And said she needed to tell me something because this has gone somewhere I'm not okay with. The photo, it turned out, was from the fundraiser. A single frame, cropped tight, of Theo and Delphi standing close together, laughing, taken at the exact moment someone had bumped into Delphi from behind and pushed her half a step into Theo's space. In the full, uncropped version, which Sage had, because she'd taken the original. You could see the person who'd bumped her, see Theo's hand raised in an instinctive, purely reflexive steadying gesture that lasted less than a second, see me standing 4 feet away in the same frame, unnoticed because I was mid-laugh at something someone else had said. Cropped correctly, it looked like an intimate moment between 2 people who'd chosen to stand close together. Delphi had had that photo blown up, printed, and, according to Sage, planned to have it revealed at the reception as proof that Theo and Delphi had a history I'd been kept from. I sat with that information for 1 full day before I did anything with it, because I wanted to be certain, and certainty in my line of work means corroboration, not conviction. I called Priya next, and Priya, to her credit, didn't lie to me either, though she was far more loyal to Delphi and gave me less. She confirmed the recording request. She confirmed the seating positioning. She would not confirm intent, because, her words, "That's Delphi's business, not mine." Fine. I didn't need her to confirm intent. I had an email in Delphi's own words that did that for me. Here's the part I haven't told anyone outside my immediate family until now. I almost didn't tell Theo any of it. Not because I doubted him. I've told you, I never doubted him for a second. But because some old, 12-year-old part of me still believed that showing him proof of what my own sister was planning would somehow make me the difficult one, the one who couldn't just let it go, the one causing the scene 3 weeks before her own wedding. I sat with the printed email and Sage's uncropped photo in a folder on my kitchen counter for 2 days, and on the second night, Theo found me staring at it instead of sleeping, and he asked what was wrong, and I told him everything. He didn't yell either. It's one of the things I love most about him. We run on the same frequency. He read the email twice, looked at the photo for a long moment, and then he said something I think about constantly. This isn't about us. This is about 30 years of your family training her to believe the only way she gets seen is by taking something of yours in front of witnesses. He was right, and it didn't make what she was planning acceptable, but it reframed what my response needed to be. This wasn't going to be solved by me screaming at my sister 3 weeks before my wedding. It needed to be solved the way I solve everything. Quietly, with documentation, at a time, and in a way I controlled. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 24 hours is the part that changes everything, and I promise you the payoff is worth it. If you haven't already, subscribe now, because this story is about to move fast. The next morning, I did something I want to be honest was not originally my idea. I called Eleanor. I'd like to tell you, Theo and I planned this together as some grand strategic partnership, but the truth is smaller and stranger than that. Eleanor Bennett had, over 6 months, said maybe 40 words to me total. Mostly logistics, venue capacities, whether I had food allergies, once, memorably, an entire unprompted lecture on why she distrusted open bars at weddings because liquor makes people say the true thing they've been rehearsing sober. I liked her immediately and found her nearly impossible to get close to, which, it turned out, was because Eleanor Bennett does not extend warmth on credit. She extends it after evidence. I called her, laid out everything. The email, the photo, Sage's call. Expecting, honestly, some version of polite concern and not much else. What I got instead was silence for almost 10 full seconds, followed by a single sentence that told me Eleanor Bennett had been doing her own quiet audit for months without telling either of us. "I've been recording her for 6 weeks," she said. "I just didn't know what it was building toward until now." It turned out Eleanor had noticed the same pattern I had, earlier and from a different angle. At the engagement party, Delphi had cornered Eleanor near the bar and asked a series of questions Eleanor found strange even at the time, about the Bennett family business, about whether Eleanor had ever regretted not getting a chance to really know someone before they married in, about whether Eleanor thought, some people are just better matches than the ones that end up happening. Eleanor, who built a company by trusting her gut about which numbers didn't add up before she could explain why, had quietly started recording voice memos on her phone anytime Delphi cornered her at a family event after that. "Not because I suspected this specific thing," she told me, "but because I've learned that people who ask questions like that are auditioning for a role nobody's cast them in." 6 weeks earlier, at a dinner Theo and I hadn't even attended, Delphi had told Eleanor directly, thinking she was speaking to a sympathetic future mother-in-law, that she believed Theo had made the easier choice, not the right one, and that she wasn't going to just sit there and pretend everything was fine at the wedding. Eleanor had the whole thing recorded. 2 minutes and 11 seconds of my sister, unprompted, laying out a grievance and something close to intent, 4 months before she ever mentioned a rough patch with Curtis to the rest of us. We didn't confront Delphi. That was the decision Eleanor, Theo, and I made together, sitting in Eleanor's kitchen 2 weeks before the wedding, and it's the decision I'd make again every time. Confronting her early would have accomplished exactly one thing. It would have let her rewrite the plan. She was resourceful, motivated, and... I want to be clear, because I don't think villains are useful, and I don't think Delphi is one. Genuinely wounded underneath all of it. Wounded in a way that had curdled into something she'd convinced herself was justice. If we tipped our hand, she'd simply find another moment, another audience, another version of the same script. What she needed, and what I needed, was for her plan to fail in exactly the venue and in front of exactly the witnesses she'd chosen for it, using her own words as the mechanism, so that there was no version of the story afterward where she got to say she'd been silenced or ambushed or misunderstood. I did 3 things in the 12 days before my wedding, and I want to walk through them precisely, because I think the precision is the actual lesson of this story. First, I called our family's estate attorney, a woman named Renata Ubel, who had handled my grandmother's trust and who I'd used twice for contract disputes at work. I didn't ask her to do anything dramatic. I asked her one question. If a guest disrupted a private event with defamatory statements made to a room full of witnesses, what was my actual legal exposure and recourse? And could a venue's private security remove a guest without creating a bigger scene than the one they were trying to prevent? She walked me through it in 11 minutes. Defamation requires a false statement of fact presented as true, made to a third party, causing harm. An accusation of infidelity or stealing a fiancé, made publicly and falsely, absolutely qualified. And Renata told me plainly that if I wanted to, I'd have grounds. I didn't want to sue my sister. I wanted the option documented, in writing, from a licensed attorney, dated before the wedding, in case anyone, my mother, later, especially, tried to claim afterward that I'd overreacted. Second, I spoke to our wedding coordinator, a sharp, unflappable woman named Odette, who had planted event flags for 2 governors and, I suspect, had seen worse than my sister. I told her, without going into the full backstory, that there was a strong possibility a guest would attempt to make a disruptive, false public statement during the reception, and I asked her to have two things ready. A discreet security presence positioned near the head table who could move calmly and quickly if needed, and a plan to redirect the room's attention. Music cue, toast schedule adjustment. Within 90 seconds of any incident, so that whatever happened would have a hard, visible endpoint instead of spiraling. Odette didn't ask a single follow-up question. She just nodded and said, "I've done this before. Not this exact version, but this shape of thing. You're not the first bride to see it coming." Third, and this is the part I'm proudest of, because it's the part that required trusting someone else with something I usually only trust myself with. I asked Eleanor if she would be willing to be the one to reveal the recording, if it came to that, instead of me. I want to explain why. If I stood up at my own wedding and produced evidence against my own sister, it plays to any onlooker who doesn't already know the full story, like a bride fighting with her sister. Messy. Symmetrical. Two women, one dress code violation, a he said, she said, the room could argue about for years at future family holidays. But if Theo's mother, a woman with no obvious motive except protecting the truth, a woman who had exactly zero prior relationship with drama in this family, stood up and revealed premeditated evidence, it stopped being a catfight and became something else entirely. A fact, delivered by a neutral party, that the room could not argue with, because the room had no story to spin about why Eleanor would lie. Eleanor agreed in 4 words. "I've been waiting to." The morning of the wedding, I did the one thing that had nothing to do with strategy. I drank my coffee. Black, 1 sugar cube, dropped in by hand and stirred exactly 3 times. The same way I've made it since I was 22. The same way I made it the morning I found the discrepancy that got a hospital system to fire a supply chain manager who'd been skimming for 4 years. The same way I made it 3 weeks earlier at my mother's kitchen table reading my sister's email for the first time. It's a small thing. It's mine. It's the thing that tells me, every single time, that whatever chaos is circling the day, I am still the same person who sat down and figured this out calmly, 1 cup at a time. The ceremony itself was perfect, and I mean that without irony. Theo cried. I didn't. My father walked me down an aisle lined with white peonies, and for 90 minutes, none of what was coming existed. Delphi was there, seated in the 2nd row, in a pale blue dress that was clearly, deliberately, not the white one. I remember thinking, watching her clap when we were announced as married, that some part of her plan required the ceremony itself to be untouched. The reception was the stage. The ceremony was just the setup. We were maybe 40 minutes into the reception, first dance done, toasts about to begin, champagne being poured for the head table, when Delphi disappeared from her seat. I noticed because I notice everything, and I noticed Priya's phone come up, angled, held low against her stomach in the specific way you hold a phone when you're recording and don't want it to look like you're recording. I felt Theo's hand find mine under the table. He'd noticed too. Delphi came back into the room in the white dress. I want to describe the room in that moment because I think it matters. 140 people, most of them mid-conversation, mid-bite, mid-laugh, the specific low, warm hum of a reception that's going exactly right. And then a shift, the way a flock of birds shifts direction all at once without any visible signal, as person after person noticed the bride's sister walking toward the head table in a dress the approximate color and cut of a wedding gown, and felt, before they understood why, that something had gone wrong. She stopped a few feet from our table, raised a glass like she was about to give an unplanned toast, and the room, trained by 100 weddings before this one to expect exactly that, went quiet and turned toward her. I just want to say something, she said, and her voice had the specific bright wobble of someone who has rehearsed sounding spontaneous. Because I think everyone deserves to know the truth about how this wedding actually came to happen. She looked directly at me. Mara didn't tell you this, but Theo and I had something before she ever came into the picture. I stayed quiet because I love my sister. But I'm done staying quiet while she gets to stand up here pretending she didn't take him from me. There it was. 11 months of small, strange things, resolved into one sentence, delivered exactly the way the email had promised, to exactly the audience she'd assembled it for. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I set my champagne flute down on the white tablecloth, slowly enough that the sound of glass touching linen was the loudest thing in the room, and I looked at my sister the way I look at a contract line item that doesn't reconcile, not with anger, with attention. "Ask him yourself," I said. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was a laugh that said she'd expected exactly this. A flustered denial, a scene, tears, something she could point to afterward as proof I had something to hide. My calm wasn't in her script. For half a second, I watched something flicker behind her eyes, the tiniest recalibration, and then she covered it with another laugh, louder, playing to the room now instead of just to me. "Of course, she's not going to admit it in front of everyone," she said to the nearest table. "That's not how this works." That's when Eleanor Bennett stood up. Eleanor is not a large woman, but she has the kind of stillness that makes rooms quiet on their own without her having to raise her voice at all. And every person at that head table and most of the tables near it turned toward her instinctively, the way you turn toward the one adult in a room who clearly already knows exactly what's about to happen. She held up her phone. "Everyone," she said, in a voice that was almost conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have, "You need to hear this recording." She didn't explain first. She didn't editorialize. She simply pressed play and set the phone down on the table, angled toward the microphone the DJ had left live from the toasts, so that the recording filled the entire tent through the reception speakers, unmistakable, unable to be talked over or reframed by anyone in that room. It was Delphi's voice, calm, unhurried, from a dinner 6 weeks earlier that none of us but Eleanor had been present for. "He made the easier choice, not the right one," her recorded voice said, clear as anything. "And I'm not going to just sit there and pretend everything's fine at the wedding. I've been thinking about how I want to do it. I want it to be somewhere she can't control the room." 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Nobody moved. I watched my sister's face do the thing I'd watched it do at the bridal shower, at the engagement party, in 100 small moments over 11 months that I'd talked myself out of naming until 3 weeks ago. That tiny, specific flicker of recalibration, except this time there was nowhere left for it to go. The room she'd chosen specifically because she couldn't be controlled in it had just heard her, in her own voice, admit she'd planned exactly that. My mother made a sound I'd never heard her make before, somewhere between a gasp and a name being cut off mid-syllable. My father sat very still, staring at his hands. Priya lowered her phone. Sage, 3 seats down, put her face in her hands. And Delphi. Delphi, who had spent 11 months building toward a single moment of maximum audience, maximum witnesses, maximum unrecoverable exposure, stood in the middle of 140 people who had just heard, in her own recorded voice, that this had never been a spontaneous truth she couldn't hold in any longer. It had been a plan, a photo cropped on purpose, a dress bought in advance, a friend positioned with a phone. Months of small, strange moments I'd trained myself not to name, finally given a name, out loud, by the one person in the room with absolutely nothing to gain from lying. She didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds. Then she set her champagne glass down, not gently, the way I had, but hard enough that it cracked at the stem. And she said, "This isn't. You're twisting this," to a room that had just heard her own voice say the opposite in real time. Nobody responded. There was nothing left to respond to. Odette, exactly as promised, had the DJ cue the next song within 90 seconds, low enough to let the moment breathe, but present enough to signal the room that the reception was, in fact, continuing, that there was a hard endpoint to whatever had just happened. 2 of the venue's security staff, who had been positioned discreetly near the tent's edge the entire evening on my instruction, walked over, not aggressively, not dramatically, simply present, and asked Delphi, quietly, if she'd like to step outside for some air. She left. Priya and Sage did not go with her. Here's what I want you to understand about the next part, because it's the part nobody tells you about moments like this. Winning doesn't feel like winning. I stood at my own wedding, married 4 hours earlier, watching my sister get walked out of a tent by hired security while 140 guests sat in stunned silence, and what I felt wasn't triumph. It was exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, something almost like grief, because the sister I'd grown up sharing a bedroom with, the one who used to make up bedtime stories for me when our parents fought downstairs, had spent 11 months constructing a plan to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved, and no recording, however clarifying, was going to undo the fact that she'd wanted to. The rest of the reception happened, technically. People danced. The cake was cut. I don't remember most of it. I remember Theo's hand never leaving mine for the rest of the night. I remember Eleanor, an hour later, finding me by the bar and saying only, "I should have shown you sooner." I was still deciding if I was certain. I told her she'd shown me at exactly the right moment, and I meant it. A week earlier, and Delphi would have had time to construct a new narrative before the wedding even happened. A week later, and it would have been too late to matter. The days after a moment like that don't resolve cleanly. And if you're expecting me to tell you my family had one big cathartic conversation and everything got fixed, that's not what happened. And I don't think that's usually what happens in real life. What happened instead was slower and in some ways harder to sit through than the wedding itself. My mother called me the next morning, not to apologize, to explain. She told me Delphi had been going through so much with the Curtis breakup that she'd never have actually gone through with it if she'd really thought it through. That families go through hard patches and we handle it internally. We don't need lawyers and recordings and security guards at a wedding. I let her finish. Then I said the only thing I had the energy to say. "You were copied on the email, Mom. You knew the plan 3 weeks before the wedding and you didn't tell me. The silence on the other end of the phone told me everything the recording hadn't already. My mother had known. She'd chosen, again, the same rule she'd raised us on. In this family, we handle things ourselves, which had never actually meant honesty. It had meant containment. Protect the appearance of the family from the truth about what was happening inside it, and let whoever got hurt absorb the cost quietly, the way I'd absorbed a wrecked car at 12 and a raided college fund at 16. I didn't yell at her either. I told her I needed distance, real distance, not the performative kind where we still show up to holidays and pretend nothing happened. I told her I'd be open to rebuilding something, eventually, but only once she was willing to say, plainly, that she'd been wrong to stay silent, not just that Delphi had been going through a lot. She didn't say it that day. It took her 3 months. Delphi, for her part, tried exactly one version of an apology in the first 2 weeks, a long text message that used the phrase, "I know I hurt you," 4 times without once specifying what she'd actually done, and ended with a request that I not let this ruin our relationship over one bad moment. I didn't respond for 11 days, which I know because I logged it, the same way I log everything. Because by then, documentation wasn't just a professional habit. It was the only language I trusted anymore inside my own family. When I did respond, I sent one message. I told her that what she'd done wasn't a bad moment. It was 11 months of a plan, and that I would consider a relationship with her again only once she could describe, specifically and without minimizing, what she'd actually done and why. The email, the cropped photo, the friend positioned with a phone, all of it, named plainly, not gestured at vaguely as hurting me. She didn't respond to that message for 6 weeks. In the meantime, consequences arrived on their own schedule, the way they usually do once you stop protecting someone from them. Delphi worked, at the time, as an account manager for a marketing firm that had, coincidentally, done contract work for one of Theo's family's logistics divisions. A detail none of us had thought much about until Priya, in an act I still don't fully understand the motive behind, forwarded a screenshot of Delphi's original planning email to 2 mutual friends who also worked in the same small local industry circle Delphi's firm operated in. I want to be clear. I didn't ask for that, didn't want it, and told Priya so when I found out. But I also understood, watching it happen, that the same instinct that made me document everything my whole life had, without my directly causing it, made Delphi's own words impossible to walk back once they existed outside her control. 6 weeks later, her firm quietly let her go during what they called a restructuring. I don't know for certain the 2 things were connected. I know Delphi believes they were, and told our mother as much, and our mother, for the first time in this entire story, didn't call to ask me to fix it. Curtis, her ex, resurfaced briefly, not to reconcile, but to tell my mother, who told me, in one of our slow, careful, 3 months later conversations, That he'd broken things off with Delphi originally because she'd told him, months before Theo and I even got engaged, that she needed to figure some things out about what she actually wanted before she could commit to him, and that hearing about the wedding had made him understand, retroactively, exactly what she'd been trying to figure out. I share these consequences not because I take satisfaction in them. I want to be honest. Some of it, I did, and some of it just made me tired. But because I think it matters to say plainly that consequences didn't come from me punishing her. They came from the truth existing in a form nobody could contain anymore. That's the whole difference between the family I grew up in and the family I'm building now. My mother's family ran on containment. Mine runs on the belief that the truth, documented plainly and delivered calmly, doesn't need anyone's permission to matter. 6 weeks after the wedding, Delphi finally responded to my message. It wasn't the apology I'd asked for. Not at first. It was defensive, it minimized, it used the word misunderstanding twice. I didn't respond to that version either. 2 months after that, she tried again, and this time it was different. She described the email, she described the photo, and admitted she'd known exactly what the crop left out. She said the sentence I'd been waiting to hear since the reception. I wanted you to feel, just once, the way I've felt my whole life, like the thing you built could be taken from you in front of everyone who mattered. It wasn't an excuse. She didn't frame it as one. It was, for the first time in either of our lives, an honest accounting of what she'd actually done and why, delivered without a single request that I immediately forgive her for it. That's the version I responded to. Not because it undid anything, but because it was the first time in 31 years my sister had told me the truth about herself without a strategy attached to it. We are not close now, not the way sisters in stories are supposed to end up close. We talk maybe once a month, careful, factual conversations, the kind you have with someone you're still deciding whether to trust again. I set the terms of that relationship, not her and not our mother. I told both of them clearly that I would not be attending family events where the story of what happened got softened into the girls had a falling out, and that any relationship going forward required them to be able to say plainly what had actually occurred. My mother, eventually, did. It took her longer than it took Delphi, honestly, because containment had been her whole worldview for 60 years, and she had to grieve the version of the family that ran on it before she could build anything honest to replace it. We're rebuilding, slowly, on my terms. I don't apologize for that anymore. Here's what I learned, and I think this is the part that matters most, more than the recording, more than the dress, more than any of it. Being the calm one, the reliable one, the fixer, isn't a character flaw, and it isn't a weakness, but it can absolutely be weaponized by people who've learned that your calm means they can do almost anything to you, and you'll absorb it rather than cause a scene. The lesson I took from 11 months of small, strange signals I talked myself out of naming isn't that I should have exploded sooner. It's that documenting the truth and choosing the moment and the mechanism for revealing it with the same care I'd bring to any audit was never a betrayal of my calm. It was the fullest use of it. My sister thought my composure was something she could walk through because our whole family had trained her to believe it. She learned, in front of 140 witnesses, that composure and permission are not the same thing, and that the quietest person in the room is very often the one who's been keeping the most careful count. If someone in your life has ever mistaken your calm for weakness, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to raise your voice for the truth to be loud. You just have to be willing to say it, once, in the room where it can't be talked over. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know if you've ever had to stay calm through your own version of this moment. Share this with someone who needs to hear that quiet doesn't mean powerless. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Calm Karma Stories, because there are a lot more of these, and I promise you, the next one hits just as hard. I'll see you in the next one.